Welcome, everyone. This is Robin Wood. Today we are presenting a webinar on the FY 2016 Title III Part F ANNH Grant competition. Okay, so we're going to go over the agenda really quickly. First, we're going to go over some important updates, the purpose of the ANNH program, the eligibility requirements, the award types, selection criteria, activities allowable and unallowable, the priorities in this year's announcement, important dates, application submission, general advice, and a Q&A session at the end of the presentation. To many of you who've attended an ANNH webinar before, things will look similar, but there are a few changes this year. So some important updates. I know many of you have emailed me about this to determine whether this is correct or not. But yes, the department has determined that an institution may hold more than one ANNH Part F grant concurrently. So this only applies to the Part F program. It was determined that regulations for Part F do not preclude an institution from holding more than one Part F grant at a time. Also, the application booklet was updated very early last week. So if you've been in since about March 2nd, you probably have the most updated version. But I did remove, there was some narrative in there about a 2-year wait-out period. That was removed because that does not apply to our program. I clarified where the narrative for the priorities should be addressed in the application. And I clarified where to upload the evidence studies if responding to one of the competitive preference priorities. So just to go over the purpose. The purpose of the ANNH program is to enable such institutions to improve and expand their capacity to serve Alaska Natives and Native Hawaiians. And you can find the regulations for this under Section 317 of the Higher Education Act of 1965 as amended. Eligibility requirements. So who may apply for this competition? An eligible institution of higher education that meets the eligibility requirements may apply. First, you would have to be designated as an eligible institution, and you would also have to meet the undergraduate enrollment percentage for this program. All applicants for the ANNH program should have applied for and received your FY 2016 designation as an eligible institution, and the eligibility deadline for submission of waivers was January 4th, 2016. I know things were done a bit differently this year with eligibility, where you didn't have to actually submit an application. A system was designed where we looked at your iPad's data, and we determined from that data if you were eligible. If you haven't already done so, you can go into the system and print off your eligibility letter for your records. Specifically for an ANNH grant, an institution at the time of application also must meet a specific undergraduate enrollment percentage. And for the Alaska Native serving institutions, that would be 20% Alaska Native students. And for the Native Hawaiian serving institutions, that would be 10% Native Hawaiian students. So award types. This year we are only doing individual development grants. The maximum award is $500,000 per project year. Estimated range of awards is $400,000 to $500,000 per project year. And we are estimating awarding 7 to 8 awards. Please note that your application will be rejected if the proposed budget exceeds the maximum award amount for a single budget period of 12 months. So if your application in year 1 is asking for $505,000, your application will automatically be rejected. So the application indicates the institution will create efforts to address challenges identified in its comprehensive development plan. It will design specific strategies to meet those challenges and issues, describe how the institution will implement the activity or activities, propose activities that do not necessarily have to be related to each other, and specifies each activity's expected outputs and outcomes. So for selection criteria, the selection criteria determine the order of your application. Please don't expect the readers to recall information from previous sections, and utilize the full page limits that we've given you so that you can really give enough details so that readers do not have to guess at what you are trying to propose. Quality of the content is key, but writing skills won't be scored, but correct grammar, uses, and spelling are important when the reviewers are reading your application. So here's the selection criteria. It looks very similar to years prior. So you have your comprehensive development plan. Total points for that would be 25. Your activity objectives, total points for that would be 15. The implementation strategy, 20 points. Key personnel, 7 points. The project management plan, 10 points. The evaluation plan, 15 points. And the budget, 8 points, which gives you a total possible points of 100. This year, we do have priorities that have associated points, so you could realistically score a maximum of 103 points on your application. So the quality of comprehensive development plan, these are some of the questions that you can ask yourself when you are preparing your application. Are the institutional strengths and challenges clearly and comprehensively analyzed? Did the analysis involve the institution's major constituencies? So did the analysis involve students, staff, community members, key positions at the institution, faculty? You need to take all that into consideration. Are the goals realistic and well planned? And are the objectives measurable and related to institutional goals? Will they contribute to the institution's growth and self-sufficiency? And what is the plan to institutionalize project achievement? And in last year's peer review, that came up a lot. There were some issues where applicants did not clearly indicate how the project would be institutionalized. And this creates a problem with the reviewer, because we're saying we're going to give you want these grant funds, and if we award these grant funds to you, great, they'll be there for 5 years, but what happens at the end of the project period? Is it going to go away if you don't have a strong institutionalization plan? Quality of activity objectives were 15 points. And you want to ask yourself, are the objectives realistic and defined in terms of measurable results for each activity? Are they related to concerns and challenges or goals identified in the comprehensive development plan? Example of an unrealistic goal is there will be a 90% retention in the nursing program in the first year. More realistically, you would say retention for nursing program students will increase by 5% from fall 2015 to fall 2016. The quality of implementation strategy is 20 points. So is the strategy comprehensive? Does it cover all the main points? Is the rationale for the implementation strategy clear and supported by research for each activity? And are the activity timetables realistic? For key personnel, if creating new positions such as the project director or activity director, what are the qualifications for those positions? Is the past experience and training of key personnel named in the grant application directly related to the activity objectives? Are the key personnel time commitments realistic? The quality of project management plan. Are the procedures for managing the project likely to ensure effective and efficient project implementation? And are the key personnel afforded sufficient authority to conduct the project effectively, including access to the president or CEO? That was something else we saw in last year's competition, where it wasn't clearly shown that the project director had sufficient access to the president or the CEO or the chancellor at the institution, and it seemed like the project director was 1 or 2 people removed, which creates an issue. You want the project director to be able to access these key key people at your institution in order to keep them interested in the grant and to ensure that the grant program is going smoothly. Quality of evaluation plan. This is where you're going to talk about your data elements and collection procedures. Are they clearly described and appropriate to measure project outcomes? Are the data analysis procedures clearly described, and are they likely to produce formative and summative results? So your formative results would be data that's qualitative or quantitative in order to improve implementation of the activity, while summative is the data on the results of implementing the activity. Your budget, are the costs necessary and reasonable? And the budget includes summary, well actually I want to go back on this. The budget for this section is just your narrative part of the selection criteria. You will do a summary for the summary budget, kind of discussing where money is going to for each activity. The detailed budget is usually in your budget narrative form. And also, this would, though, include your overall summary budget for the project. And the budget is used by the reader to review allowable and reasonable costs, and also by the program office. The funds can be reduced if we see that you have asked for or been granted funding and there's an unallowable activity. We will contact you, and we will ask you to, let's see where we can move the funds because the activity is unallowable. So when you are writing the grant application, make sure that your activities are allowable. So let's go into those allowable and unallowable activities. So here, what you will see is the program statute for allowable activities. You can find this information in the Higher Education Act of 1965 as amended in Section 371. For unallowable activities, we follow Title 34 of the Code of Federal Regulations, Section 607.10C. There's links here, but if you also go onto the ANNH website, you can also link to those regulations from there. So this program provides grant funding to do the following: plan, develop, undertake, and carry out activities to improve and expand your institution's capacity to serve Native Americans, which may include this list here. So I have a list that I've put together of allowable activities. I won't go read them through them all for you right now, but it includes things such as academic tutoring and counseling programs, and student support services, renovation, purchase, rental, or lease of scientific or laboratory equipment. I just want to remind you here that this is a program that is here to strengthen the institution. We've seen a lot of grant applications come through asking for direct student aid, such as student tuition and things like that. We do not provide direct student aid unless in very specific circumstances. And it's usually when someone is working on the grant itself, and in most cases when we're being asked to provide direct student funds, it's not for that capacity. So just remember, the activities that you're proposing should be strengthening the institution. And here are some sample activities. Internationalization of curriculum, faculty development, tutoring, mentoring, establishing learning communities, improving the infrastructure for internet access. And I'll just say here, this will be posted, this webinar will be posted on the ANNH website, or at least a link to it will be, so you can take a look at these in a little more in-depth view. Once again, these are just sample activities. So, unallowable activities. The grant funds should supplement and not supplant, which means that they should enhance the institution's funds and not replace them. So if the institution has been paying for a faculty member to attend a conference in prior years, grant funds cannot now be used to fund that faculty's attendance to that conference, since in the past the institution has paid for that. Some more unallowable activities, anything that's not included in your approved application, any activities or services relate to sectarian instruction or religious worship, activities that are operational in nature rather than developmental in nature. And here's another list. This is just some sound bites I pulled from the Code of Federal Regulations. You want to go there so that you can read the entire language they have in there for the unallowable activities. As you see, we have advertising and public relations costs. Technically, normally they are unallowable activities, but there are times when they are considered allowable. So that's why you really want to take a look at the cost principles and see exactly what is allowable and what's unallowable. Services to high school students is unallowable. Developing or improving community-based or community services programs. These are just a few things that are unallowable activities under the ANNH program. So the priorities. This year, we do have an absolute priority, and it is a mandatory response. You must respond to the absolute priority. If you do not, your application will not be reviewed. You are given 3 pages to address the absolute priority. This is in addition to the 50 pages you have to address your project narrative. We have 2 competitive preference priorities this year. The first is evidence of promise. You do have 3 additional pages for that. It is an optional response. You do not have to answer the CPP. The next is competitive preference priority number 2, and that's moderate evidence of effectiveness. That's 3 additional pages that you are allowed to add to your project narrative. And I meant to say for CPP 1, you can get 1 additional point, and CPP 2, you can get 3 additional points. However, you may only address 1 CPP. You must choose either competitive preference 1 or 2. And if you choose 2 and the evidence does not meet what Works Clearinghouse standards, but for moderate evidence, but meets evidence of promise, you will receive that 1 point for the evidence of promise. There's the invitational priority, which is optional also. You have 2 additional pages to answer that. That's no additional points. And you must include a separate heading in the narrative for each priority you address. So in the project narrative, that's where you will address the narrative portion of your priorities. And I will talk about this later, the actual studies, though, will be uploaded to the other attachment section in grants.gov. And once again, you can only choose up to 2 studies, maximum 2 studies. If you respond to CPP 1, you can only upload 2 studies for that, or if you choose CPP 2, you can only upload up to 2 studies for that. The absolute priority is projects that support high-need students, which are designed to improve their academic outcomes, learning environments, or both. And this priority addresses high-need students, students with disabilities, English learners, disconnected youth or migrant youth, and low-skilled adults. This is a mandatory response. Once again, you must address the absolute priority. There are no additional points attached to this, but you do receive 3 additional pages in your project narrative to address it. CPP 1 is application supported by evidence of effectiveness that meets the conditions set out in the definition of evidence of promise. And this definition can be found in the Notice Inviting Applications for ANNH that was published on February 26th. You will receive, if you do meet this definition of evidence of promise, you will receive 1 point. Once again, it's optional, and you do have 3 pages to address the narrative. CPP 2, this is application supported by evidence of effectiveness that meets the conditions set out in the definition of moderate evidence of effectiveness. And this definition is also found in the ANNH. Applicants that apply, once again, under CPP2 but do not meet the moderate evidence of effectiveness standard may still be considered under CPP1 evidence of promise. For CPP2, you can receive 3 additional points. It is an optional response, and you do have 3 additional pages to address that. So your PDF of studies, as I mentioned before, should be uploaded, and this is the actual study itself, should be uploaded to the other attachment section of grants.gov. And we have this in your application booklet, but for CPP1, you should title your document Competitive Preference Priority 1, Evidence of Promise, or if it's CPP2, just entitle it Competitive Preference Priority 2, Moderate Evidence of Effectiveness. And again, you may submit a maximum of 2 studies for the CPP you choose. So at this time, I'd like to turn the presentation over to Jonathan Jacobson of IES to talk a little bit more about evidence definition.
Thank you, Robin. This is John Jacobson. I'm with the National Center for Education Evaluation and Regional Assistance, which is within the Institute of Education Sciences, which is the research, statistics, and evaluation arm of the Department of Education. For my presentation today on the evidence definitions that relate to this competition, I first would like to provide a little bit of motivation about why we should care about evidence when making decisions that relate to education. I'll give an introduction to the What Works Clearinghouse. I'll describe definitions of strong theory and logic models that are relevant when considering evidence. I'll describe in detail the definition of evidence of promise that's applicable for the competitive priority. And then I'll turn to the definition of evidence of effectiveness that's applicable. First, why should we care about evidence? The poet Walt Whitman said, "I like the scientific spirit, the holding off, the being sure but not too sure, the willingness to surrender ideas when the evidence is against them. This is ultimately fine. It always keeps the way beyond open, always gives life, thought, affection, the whole man, a chance to try over again after a mistake, after a wrong guess." And as you know, the U.S. Department of Education and its grantees are placing an increasing emphasis on using evidence and building empirical evidence of the effectiveness of education interventions, where interventions can be understood broadly to apply to programs, policies, and practices. So where do you go to find evidence to support education decisions? There are several possible places to look. The first is to rely on ourselves, to rely on our own knowledge and experience that's relevant for the decision we face. Another possibility is to turn to colleagues, peers, program administrators who may have valuable insights that can inform a decision. Third possibility is to turn to a professional association that has perhaps summarized evidence and reviewed evidence that's relevant for the decision we might face. Another possibility is to turn to academic researchers or researchers with non-academic organizations who have done studies and built evidence in a particular area. And a final possibility is to go online to look at news articles, blogs, journal articles, although sometimes these are behind paywalls and are not always easy to access or to understand. The What Works Clearinghouse is an initiative of the Department of Education's Institute of Education Sciences, or IES, and the WWC reviews, rates, and summarizes original studies of the effectiveness of education interventions. There's a wide range of studies included in the category of education research. The WWC only looks at some of these studies. They need to be original studies focused on effectiveness of education interventions. So as a result, WWC does not rate qualitative studies, descriptive studies, or the reanalysis or synthesis of others' data. When reviewing effectiveness studies, the WWC applies evidence standards. These standards were developed by panels of national experts for different types of studies looking at effectiveness. The Standards focus on the internal validity of the estimates reported by a study, which means whether an estimated impact of an intervention is valid or whether it's likely to be biased. The standards are applied by teams of certified WWC reviewers and result in one of three possible study ratings for an intervention study. The highest rating would be that the study meets WWC standards without reservations. The next highest rating would be the study meets WWC standards with reservations. And the third possible rating would be that the study does not meet WWC standards. First, some notes about WWC evidence ratings. Meets standards with or without reservations is applied to study findings, not the intervention itself. The rating is a rating of the finding from the study. The study as a whole receives a rating that's reported in the reviewed studies database when the study has already been reviewed by the WWC. And this is the rating of the highest rated finding reviewed by the WWC, but that might be different from the finding that's most relevant for your project. So you might need to look at a study more closely to see, is there a finding that's relevant for what you propose to do with your project? That might not be the study that, the finding that resulted in the study's rating in the WWC database. A high study rating is not the WWC's endorsement of an intervention or a determination that either the intervention or the finding is relevant for your project. The WWC rating says something about the quality of the evidence. It doesn't say that the intervention itself is a high-quality intervention. You would need to look at the study and draw conclusions about the intervention and the relevance of particular findings for yourself, and then you would need to argue in your proposal that the finding was relevant for something you proposed to do in your project. The sign, size, and statistical significance of the estimated effect are reported by the WWC, but they do not affect the WWC study rating. The rating is a rating about the quality of the study, not whether the study found a large positive effect, for example. So a study rating of meets WWC standards does not mean that the intervention is effective. This gets back to my point that the rating by the What Works Clearinghouse is a rating of the quality of the study and of the particular findings in the study, not a rating of the quality of the intervention. A study that has a high WWC rating might find the intervention had large significant effects, or it might find it had no detectable or discernible effect. You'd have to look at the study to see the finding. Study ratings from the clearinghouse can change when WWC standards are updated. So the reviewed studies database that's on the What Works Clearinghouse website includes some ratings that might be out of date. The grant notice says that the studies need to be reviewed under version 3.0 What Works Clearinghouse standards. Some of those reviews done a long time ago might have been done under older versions of the standards, so that if the study were cited in an application, the study would need to be re-reviewed. And because the standards are updated, the result of the review of the study might not be identical to the review before. Evidence depends upon strong theory and logic models as described in the department's general administrative regulations, known as EDGAR. And these regulations define strong theory as meaning a rationale for the proposed process, product, strategy, or practice that includes a logic model. What's a logic model? A logic model, also known as a theory of action, means a well-specified conceptual framework that identifies key components of the proposed process, product, strategy, or practice and describes the relationships among the key components and outcomes. So why am I saying this? It's because if you're looking for evidence, either evidence of promise or moderate evidence of effectiveness, it's valuable to have a logic model for your project that would define a key component of your project that you're proposing in your application, and would also define outcomes that you hope will be influenced by that component, and then to find a study that actually is a study of the effectiveness of the component on the outcome of interest. This then would establish the relevance of the study to what you propose to do. So what are the components of a logic model? The Pacific Regional Educational Laboratories put together a publication on developing program logic models. The link to it is provided on this slide. And that document defines the components of a program logic model as including resources, or the materials to implement the program, activities, the steps for program implementation, outputs, which are the products of the program, the immediate products, and then impacts on outcomes, the changes in program participants' knowledge, beliefs, or behavior. So what does a logic model look like in practice? Well, here's an example for the program I just introduced you to, the What Works Clearinghouse. The resources for the clearinghouse are researchers' studies, which sometimes are frequently entered into the Education Resources Information Center database. That's a database on the IES website, accessible from the IES website that I'll share with you momentarily. The clearinghouse takes these resources, these studies, and then its primary activity is to review the evidence in those studies using the evidence standards as supplied by a team of certified reviewers. So this evidence review then produces an output, which is frequently a What Works Clearinghouse publication available for free on the IES website. These publications are then intended to have impacts immediately on practitioners by informing their decisions, and over the longer run by informing practitioners to make decisions that will contribute to improve student outcomes. So that's the longer run goal of the clearinghouse. Now, in this logic model, the information doesn't just flow from researchers to the clearinghouse and from the clearinghouse to practitioners. There also is a flow of information in the opposite direction. If practitioners have areas or populations of interest to them, they can make suggestions to the clearinghouse for future publications. In addition, the publications the clearinghouse releases can inform the decisions of researchers, both decisions about what to study and what methods to use and how to document their research and their studies. So the department's regulations define not only theory, but evidence, which goes beyond theory, by having an empirical basis that a program works. There are 3 levels of evidence distinguished in the department's regulations: evidence of promise, moderate evidence of effectiveness, and strong evidence of effectiveness. It's the first 2 levels that are applicable for this competition, so I'll describe them in greater depth. First, evidence of promise. Evidence of promise is defined by the department's regulations as empirical evidence to support the theoretical linkages between at least one critical component and at least one relevant outcome presented in the logic model for the proposed process, product, strategy, or practice. So again, this shows the importance of having a logic model for a project, defining the critical components of the program or project, and defining relevant outcomes to be affected by those components. And the evidence then has to relate to at least one of the components and at least one of the outcomes. Evidence of promise needs to include one study that falls into one of 3 categories. The first is a correlational study with statistical controls for selection bias. So I'll describe in a moment in detail what that would involve in a study. The second possibility is a quasi-experimental design study that meets What Works Clearinghouse evidence standards with reservations. I'll describe that. And then the third possibility is a randomized controlled trial that meets What Works Clearinghouse evidence standards with or without reservations. An additional requirement for evidence of promise is that the study must have found a statistically significant or substantively important favorable association between at least one critical component and one relevant outcome presented in the logic model for the proposed process, product, strategy, or practice. So this gets back to the logic model for the project. And a statistically significant difference is one that, if it arose by chance, would be unlikely to arise by chance. A substantively important association is defined in the regulations as 0.25 standard deviations or larger. Now, what's a correlational study with statistical controls? A correlational study looks at the association between receipt of an intervention, which could be a component of the project, and an outcome, relevant outcome of interest. An intervention can be a process, product, strategy, practice, program, or policy. It's a very broad definition of intervention. Statistical controls for selection bias are how study authors attempt to compare subjects similar except for the receipt of the intervention. If a study is, and its authors are trying to study the impact of an intervention, they want to compare apples to apples when it comes to subjects, students, for example. They don't want to compare apples to oranges and risk confusing the difference between the students with the effect of the intervention. Selection bias can be defined as an error in choosing the individuals or subjects to take part in a study. Ideally, the subjects in a study should be very similar to one another. If there are important differences between the groups, the results of the study may not be valid. So in asking you to provide or point to evidence of promise or evidence of effectiveness, there's a concern that the study you point to address the risk of selection bias. Why do impact studies need comparison groups? Comparison groups are an important feature of studies that attempt to control or account for the possibility of selection bias. Suppose you were looking at program outcomes over 3 years for a program that was implemented in the year 2015. You had outcomes for students in the year 2014, which could be considered a baseline year, and then you also had outcomes for 2016 as well as 2015. And suppose the outcomes were improving over time. If you just looked at outcomes for students in the program, students receiving the intervention, and saw improvement over time, you could attribute that to the program and say it must be the program is effective. But there is a risk. If you had an equivalent comparison group that was the same in terms of its outcomes at baseline, but had better outcomes in the 2 subsequent years, then that would suggest that the program was not contributing as much to positive outcomes for the students as whatever services were being received by the comparison group. So having a comparison group is really important for an impact study, for a study of effectiveness, because it allows the study authors to compare similar groups of students, one group that receives the intervention, the other group that does not. The group that does not receive the intervention still might be getting other services, so it's really important to understand what that contrast is. But when there is a good comparison group, meaning a group that's equivalent to the program group, the intervention group, at baseline, the difference between the groups can then be attributed to the difference in the interventions received. And as a result, it can generate a valid estimate of the impact of the intervention. So there are different ways that researchers seek to form equivalent comparison groups. It's important to be aware of these when looking for studies that might provide evidence of promise or evidence of effectiveness. A good way to form a comparison group is to select what's known as a matched comparison group that's similar to the intervention group in terms of relevant measured characteristics. This is known as a quasi-experimental design, or QED. At best, it can meet WWC group design standards with reservations. A better way to form a comparison group is if there's a rating variable, a measure of need or merit, that was used to assign higher rated subjects to the intervention and lower rated subjects to a comparison group. And then the effects of the intervention were estimated for students on the margin of eligibility. This is known as a regression discontinuity design, or RDD. It, at best, can meet WWC RDD standards without reservations. The clearinghouse has separate standards for RDD studies from group design studies because of the particular features of regression discontinuity designs. The best way to form comparison groups, if feasible, is to conduct a randomized controlled trial in which a lottery is used to assign some eligible subjects to the intervention and other eligible subjects to a control group. That sort of study can meet the highest evidence rating for the clearinghouse, which meets WWC standards without reservations. So the table on this slide shows the different types of clearinghouse evidence ratings, the three types of ratings by column. The highest rating on the left side, column on the left side, is meets WWC standards without reservations. The middle column is meets WWC standards with reservations, and the right-hand side column is does not meet WWC standards. Then the three rows below the header show different types of study designs, and randomized controlled trials can meet the highest rating, but sometimes they can have some problems with the design or implementation of the study, and as a result they might meet WWC standards with reservations, or they might not meet WWC standards at all. Similarly, RDD studies can meet each of the three ratings. They can meet without reservations, they can meet WWC standards with reservations, or they can be rated as not meeting WWC standards according to the protocol that's used to review them. Quasi-experimental designs such as match comparison studies cannot meet the highest WWC rating, but they can meet WWC design standards with reservations. It's also possible that they do not meet WWC standards because of some limitation of the study of either its design or its implementation, or the documentation the study authors make. An important point is if you're seeking studies to provide evidence of promise, all of the studies described in this table can provide evidence of promise. Meeting WWC standards is not an absolute requirement for providing evidence of promise. It is, however, for evidence of effectiveness, and I'll describe that in a moment. First, if you're looking for studies, there are several resources available at the website of the National Center for Education Evaluation and Regional Assistance at IES. And these resources, these three distinct resources, may be useful to you if you are seeking studies that relate to components that you propose to include in your project. The first resource is the broadest, that's ERIC, the Education Resources Information Center. It contains a searchable digital database of studies. These studies are not just effectiveness studies. They can be descriptive studies. They can be all sorts of different education studies. But that's the broadest database to look for studies that might be relevant in supporting an application that is competing under the priority for evidence of promise or evidence of effectiveness. Other studies and assistance from librarians is available through the National Library of Education, which can also be accessed from the IES website. And third, the What Works Clearinghouse has a reviewed studies database listing studies reviewed by the WWC in the past, describing the WWC rating of the study and the reason for review, and including a link to any WWC publication describing the review in greater detail. Not every review links to a publication. Some reviews were done for reasons of a previous competition, so there might not be a publication. The rating, as I said earlier, is the rating of the highest rated finding for the study. It might not be the finding that's relevant for your project. And a third caution is that if the study was reviewed in the past, it might have been reviewed under an older set of What Works Clearinghouse standards, and if you cite this study and point to it in your application, it might be that the study will need to be reviewed again, and the rating that's applicable for your project is not guaranteed to be the same as the rating in the past. So just important to keep that in mind and to make sure you're citing a study that is relevant for your project and has the finding that corresponds with the level of evidence for which you're competing. So to summarize evidence of promise, a study providing evidence of promise, if you're citing that study in your application, would investigate the effect of the intervention or a key component on a relevant outcome. And there's going to be a determination that that intervention is relevant based on your logic model for your program, what you propose to do for your project, and the outcome also has to be one that's relevant for your program. That's not a determination made by the clearinghouse, but it will be made by the peer reviewers in looking over your application. A study providing evidence promise, furthermore, needs to include a treatment group and a comparison group to associate differences in outcomes with the receipt of the intervention, and also include statistical controls for selection bias. As I described, there's more than one way study authors can control for selection bias, but there needs to be some effort for that to happen in order to qualify as a study under the evidence of promise definition. Finally, a study providing evidence of promise needs to show a statistically significant or a substantively important effect on a key outcome. Sometimes studies are done with small samples. They're not large enough to detect statistically significant differences. However, if a study finds a substantively important effect studying a small population of students, it can still meet the evidence of promise requirement. The definitions for those were in this presentation. They're also in the substantively important definition is also in the grant notice. Now, in contrast to a study providing simply evidence of promise, a study providing moderate evidence of effectiveness needs to meet What Works Clearinghouse standards. It either needs to be a study that meets What Works Clearinghouse standards without reservations. That's typically a randomized controlled trial, although there's also that evidence category for regression discontinuity designs. The study can meet with reservations, which means it can be a wider range of designs. It could be a RCT, it could be a quasi-experimental design. But if the study only meets What Works Clearinghouse standards with reservations, it needs to include a large multi-site sample. The definition of a large sample, multi-site sample are in the grant notice. The study providing moderate evidence of effectiveness needs to have overlap with the population proposed for the intervention or the settings proposed for the intervention. And finally, a study providing moderate evidence of effectiveness needs to show a statistically significant favorable impact with no statistically significant and overriding impacts in that study or other studies reviewed and reported by the What Works Clearinghouse. So just contrast that with the previous slide with evidence of promise. There, the effect needs to be either statistically significant or substantively important on a key outcome. For moderate evidence of effectiveness, it needs to be statistically significant. The sample needs to be large enough for the authors to report a statistically significant favorable impact, and there cannot be statistically significant overriding unfavorable impacts on other outcomes reported by the clearinghouse. So I'm sure you might have questions on the evidence definitions or on the What Works Clearinghouse as it relates to this competition. Be happy to respond to those at the end of the presentation, but I'm going to turn the presentation back to Robin.
Thank you, John. I just wanted to emphasize before we move on to invitational priority, during the peer review, the peer reviewers will look at your narrative that you provide for the competitive preference priority, so those extra pages you have in your narrative. They will review that narrative for relevance, to see if what you're proposing, your activities proposed, are relevant to the study that you provide in the other attachment section. So once again, the reviewers will look for relevance, and then the What Works Clearinghouse will actually determine if the study meets moderate evidence of effectiveness or evidence of promise. So the invitational priority, there's only one. I think we had the same one last year. It's projects that support activities that strengthen native language preservation and revitalization. Once again, this is an optional response. There are no points associated with this priority, responding to this priority, and you do have 2 pages to respond to this priority. So let's go over some important dates. First of all, the notice inviting applications for the ANNH Part F grant competition was published in the Federal Register on February 26, 2016. The closing date is April 26, 2016 at 4:30 and no seconds Washington, D.C. time. You must have your your application in no later than that date and time. If you miss that time or you wait till the last minute to submit your application, there are chances that you will run into a lot of web traffic and your application may get stuck in that traffic and may not come through till 4:32. If that happens, we will not review your application. So please, please, please submit applications early, as early as possible. We are planning to have the peer review sometime in June. So just to let you know, we do plan to have the peer review around the June time frame. Application submission. As you all know, we ask that you submit your application through grants.gov. Here are the funding opportunity numbers for both programs. One is the Alaska Native, which is 84.031R, and Native Hawaiian 84.031V. You can also search for these opportunities by those CFDA numbers. Just leave out the alpha part of that. You just would want the 84.031 when you do the search. So I'll give you a few minutes to jot that down really quick. So it seems like the only thing that's different between the top and the bottom is the last 3 digits. Once again, grants.gov, please register if you have not already registered with grants.gov. Submit your application early. Grants.gov puts a time and date stamp on every application. Verify that your submission is okay. You want to verify that grants.gov received your submission on time and it was validated successfully. You would go to do this, you go to grants.gov and click on Track My Application link. And submission problems. If you have any problems with grants.gov, unfortunately I can't help you. I would love to, but I can't. So you could go to grants.gov customer service support. That's also in our application booklet. The number is 1-800-518-4726, or at their website or at their self-service portal. And this is also in the application booklet. Applications must be submitted electronically. Of course, unless you qualify for an exception. You can look in the NIA, and that will explain our requirements for you to obtain an exception. You have to meet those requirements before we will grant that. Once again, all applications must be received by April 26, 2016, no later than the time posted here. Unfortunately, late submissions will be rejected. I know I keep repeating myself, but it's happened time and time again in other programs where people have come in on the last day at the last second and try to upload their application, and it just isn't happening. And unless there's a true technical issue with grants.gov, you're probably not going to get your application reviewed. So for page limits, for your selection criteria that we discussed earlier, you have 50 pages. For your absolute priority, you have 3 additional pages. If you choose either the competitive preference priority, you will have 3 additional pages to address that priority. And you have 2 additional pages for the invitational priority. If you exceed that page limit, your application will be disqualified. So in the project narrative section, you cannot go over 58 pages if you address every single priority. You cannot have additional pages. You can't use those extra 8 pages for your selection criteria. That is limited to 50 pages. The additional pages are only to address your priority. Here we go again. What's included in the page count? For your project narrative, that would be your responses to your selection criteria, which is 50 pages, and your narrative responses to the priority. Absolute priority, mandatory, and then either competitive preference priority you choose, which is optional, and then also your invitational priority. So all your narrative responses to the priorities will also go in the project narrative section of grants.gov along with your selection criteria responses. As I said before, if you address all the priorities, the application narrative must not exceed 58 pages. And if you upload any other documentation to this project narrative section, it will count towards your page count. So if you upload anything else other than what we've had listed here, it will count towards your page count, and it could take you over and make you become disqualified. What is not included in the page count? So this is also in the application booklet, but your application for federal assistance, your supplemental information for the SF-424 form, your budget information on construction programs, your budget narrative, which is where you do actually go into detail about your budget, your assurances and certifications, table of contents, one-page program abstract, if you choose to submit resumes, a bibliography, your letters of support, your program profile, and your PDF of evidence studies. We do ask, once again, that you limit those to 2 studies for your selected CPP respondents. Please follow all instructions completely. If you have any questions, please let me know. I will be happy to answer them for you. Read and reread the instructions for complete understanding. Even I have to read the application booklet multiple times. So I know that you probably have to go back to it a couple times and maybe fully understand what's in there, because it is a lot of information. And you are only being evaluated solely by the information you provide in your application. Please ensure you have institutional buy-in. Be active in your application writing process. And don't allow the reviewer to make assumptions about your project. If you don't put something into your project narrative and you think the reviewer is just going to assume it, please don't do that. The reviewers are looking for explicit explanations about what your goals are and how you will achieve them, and you must address each component of the selection criteria. Refer to the application checklist that's at the back of your application booklet to ensure that you have all the forms that are required. Your application will be disqualified if you do not provide all required documentation. The only things that are optional are your responses to the competitive preference priority or the invitational priority. Those are the only 2 optional responses. Again, please submit your applications as soon as possible. And here's 5 key reasons your application may be disqualified: exceeding the allotted page limits, asking for more than $500,000 in a project year, not responding to the absolute priority, not including all required documentation such as your separate GEPA statement, submitting your application after the deadline date and time. And here's contact information. I think most of you know how to contact me. My email is robyn, ROBYN, .wood@ed.gov. My phone number is 202-453-7744. This is the ANNH website link, and that will take you to all the applicant information. It will also take you to where the link is for the posting of the recorded webinar. That should go up on our website sometime tomorrow, so I would check back throughout the day tomorrow. Tomorrow, and I sent this out through a blast email, and if you haven't received that, please let me know. What Works Clearinghouse will be hosting, IES will be hosting Applying What Works Clearinghouse Standards to Post-Secondary Research, March 10th from 1 to 2 p.m. Eastern Time. Here's a link here. I sent it out to everyone. If you want the link, just email me. I'll send it out to you so you don't have to write it all down. So I just want to thank you for your interest in applying for the ANNH program, and at this time we will start taking questions.
Our next question coming from McBride. Your line is now open.
Hi. I have a question about the allowable cost for instruction. So basically we're trying to figure out where it is that a person can offer something that is we want to bring in science. We don't have science in those areas now, and we want to revamp our Associate of Science programs to be more inclusive. Overall, we would like to have catalog courses that would go towards the degree program, but we want to be able to list to offer them by distance, and we want to be able to incorporate aspects of traditional knowledge in them. Does that fall within what we can do?
Yes. It does.
I have a second question, and that is, where do you put the logic model?
That is part of the design. So I would think that would go into the narrative portion of the response for evidence of promise. So that would go in your narrative section.
Okay, but where exactly in the narrative section?
When you're responding to your competitive preference priority, just put a heading in there. And when you're in your project narrative and you're doing your application, just do a heading saying competitive preference priority 1, evidence of promise, and then you do your when you write your narrative up, you can include the logic model there.
Okay, so it's not in the 50 pages.
No, the logic model is not. That's for the selection criteria only.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you for asking that. You're welcome.
No questions in queue at this time. Once again, for our participants over the phone, if you would like to ask a question, you may press star followed by the number 1, and please don't forget to record your name. One moment. We have another question in queue. One moment while I get the name.
Sure.
Our next question coming from Melissa. Your line is now open.
Yes, my question is about the What Works Clearinghouse standards, and if the grant is focused on renovations, which seems like an allowable expense, it doesn't seem like those kind of projects are really focused on the What Works Clearinghouse standards. Those are more about implementations of programs rather than renovations. So how would you address that within your narrative?
Well, I think you're going to have to consider what you're proposing to do with the project, and then whether what you're proposing to do with the project would include any components that could qualify under the competitive priorities, either the evidence of promise or the moderate evidence of effectiveness. The clearinghouse reviews interventions that are focused on impacting student outcomes. So to submit something for the clearinghouse review to meet clearinghouse standards with or without reservations and thereby meet the moderate evidence of effectiveness, you would need to identify a study of the impact of that component on student outcomes, where student outcomes could be a wide range of outcomes, but that is the focus of the clearinghouse. For evidence of promise, you would need to look at favorable associations between the component that is profiled in the study and relevant outcomes for the program. So the standards for evidence of promise are broader than for moderate evidence of effectiveness. It is not necessary to meet clearinghouse standards for evidence of promise as long as the study looks at the association between a component and a relevant outcome in your logic model, and there was some effort in the study to account for selection bias.
Okay, but you wouldn't have selection or participants if it's renovations.
I think by accounting for selection bias, it would mean that a study that would qualify under evidence of promise would need to be comparing apples to apples, either when it comes to students or institutions. So it's not selection necessarily at the student level, it could be selection at the student.
Okay. But can you address how you would, if you're doing a renovation project, how does that
My actual suggestion to you would be to search through.
Excuse me, I'm sorry to interrupt for just a second. Ian, we can hear a line that's been hung up. Oh, there we go. We're better. Thank you.
My suggestion would be if you're considering particular components to your program, to go to the ANNH database, which is the broadest database available, or the National Library of Education, and see if there are studies that would help you for whatever competitive priority you're considering. There would be a broader selection of studies there, and then you could consider, once you found studies, whether they would help you applying for under a particular competitive priority.
And remember, those are optional. The CPPs are optional. And as John was saying, with renovation, it would look more, the study should look more at what are the outcomes of the renovation? Is it just to update a building, or are you putting in projects or activities that would impact student outcomes by doing this renovation? And there may not be a study out there. I'm with John to go and look at ANNH and kind of do a broad search, but there may not be a study out there, and it may be that you're not replying to the CPP. But I would check with the ANNH database first, just to see if you can find anything that relates to a component of the renovation.
And I just emphasize again that the clearinghouse has a narrower focus on student outcomes than the evidence of promise definition, which is the focus is on relevant outcomes.
Yes. The evidence of promise is what I'm understanding, John, is more about relevance, and modern evidence of effectiveness is more about student outcomes.
Right, but obviously they have to be relevant also.
Right, of course they have to be relevant also.
But the focus for the clearinghouse is relevant student outcomes.
Right. Okay. Thank you.